The VVN Music Interviews are brought to you by VVN Music. Get the latest news on the veteran artists of rock, pop, soul, country, folk, and blues at vvnmusic.com. Hi, and welcome to episode 50 of the VVN Music Interviews. I'm Roger Wink, and our guest today is Rachael Sage. Rachael is a true Renaissance woman of the arts. She started to play piano at 2.5, studied ballet from a young age and danced for the New York City Ballet, wrote poetry, acted, painted, and most famously became a successful singer-songwriter. She's also a label owner, starting her own Empress Records, which has released every one of her recordings from her 1996 debut through to her latest, an EP of songs for the holiday season. You have this amazing background where you're kind of a Renaissance woman in the arts between, dance, music, songwriting, poetry, acting, and so forth. And now you've gone forward and you have this brand new Christmas EP that, it's not Christmas, holiday EP that you're putting out.
I don't need to correct you. You did it for yourself.
Yes.
So. Excellent. Essentially, the first song that I had recorded for this EP was a long-awaited, anticipated version of my song Tchotchkes and Latkes, which is a fun Hanukkah song that I wrote for a holiday show of the same name at a venue called Joe's Pub in New York City. And I actually had the title for the show before I had the theme song, per se. So I just knew that I wanted to do a show that celebrated the holidays in New York. And I had already handpicked some other holiday music and some songs from my repertoire that I felt fit the season. And this was a few years ago now. And then, like in the final hour, really that week before the show, I wrote this little campy little song, Tchotchkes and Latkes. And I had just never recorded it, but fans had asked me for it over the years. And eventually, last year just felt like, I should just commit this to the Pro Tools. and I had a lot of fun with it. It's, sort of a silly theatrical take on all the fun traditions of Hanukkah. And then once I had that song in the can, I realized that, oh wow, I have this version of Joy to the World that a friend of mine, who happens to be in my band, Andy Mack, he's my drummer, he had asked me to perform it at a benefit for a wonderful cancer foundation that he fundraises for. And every year he has a holiday show at a great little venue in New York called Cafe Vivaldi. And last year I performed Joy to the World. And it just sort of fell into my hands and my psyche naturally. I'm not the most frequent cover artist. I don't do a lot of cover songs, but I had a lot of fun with it. And I thought, well, I'll record that one too and see how that goes. And then after that, I was like, I'm going to do a whole EP. And that's really sort of where this was all sparked from. So
there's another song on there also that you had been performing for a couple of years, wasn't there?
Yes, Hanukkah in the Village, which was also from one of my holiday shows at Joe's Pub. And part of that, when I wrote it, I was sort of improvising some of it live and coming up with funny kind of trick holiday isms. And some of them are even a little anachronistic now. I make reference to a funky East Village clothing store called Patricia Field, which was owned by the famous costume designer of the same name who did Sex and the City and a bunch of other movies. And that is now no longer in business. So that's sad, but it harkens to a time when my neighborhood was a little bit more artsy, I guess, and a little more funky in that traditional East Village way. So that's, sort of a tongue-in-cheek ballad, again, about Hanukkah. And then the EP is rounded out with a Yiddish song that I learned just a few months ago to perform at a benefit for the National Yiddish Theater. And in spite of my Jewish ancestry, I had never sung a song in Yiddish. I never met my grandparents, and I wish I had. I wish that they had taught me, that very interesting and evocative language, but, I just kind of learned it by rote, and it's a beautiful love song that I performed at a benefit for the theater company after I heard Mandy Patinkin perform it, and I'm a big, big fan of his, so that was what sparked me to want to cover it.
You learn a lot of things by rote because that's also how you learned how to play piano, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I learned to play piano by ear. When I say by rote, I mean that I actually had to memorize phonetically how to sing the song versus truly understanding as I was speaking it, as I was singing it, what the words meant. So, memorizing versus actually speaking the language. But yeah, I learned piano by ear when I was about 2.5, 3 years old. I sat down at my family's piano in the living room and I started playing. I think my very first song was Oklahoma. And I had been to the Broadway show with my family over like a, Christmas vacation or something from school. And instead of going on trips, my mom always thought it was a great idea to just go into New York, and she would bring us to some kind of show, whether it was a dance show or an off-Broadway or Broadway play. And I look back on that and I'm so, so grateful for those opportunities that really kind of blew my mind and kick-started my own creativity. So.
I guess I need to talk to my granddaughter who just turned 4, and because she isn't doing that with piano, and go, hey, why can't you do what Rachael did?
No. She just needs to find her own thing. But I think the trick is to just make everything available as much as we can to kids, because as we know, if you don't have the opportunity or you don't have music or art in school, it's it's up to the parents and any other mentors in their life, grandparents, to do that encouraging. So yeah, I think you're right on the money with the encouraging part.
This is essentially a 4-song EP, a 5-song, because I think there's 2 versions of Joy to the World on there.
Yeah, I couldn't make up my mind. I had 2 different amazing engineers who wanted to mix that track when they heard it. And I thought, you know what? I'll just put them both on. See what people like best.
Was there any thought of expanding to a full album, or did you feel that
I did.
you had said...
I considered it, yeah. But the reason I didn't is because I actually finished up these particular tracks concurrently to recording my next album. So I, was tracking and completing these intermittently, between also doing my original songs this past 6 months or so at the same studio, and then doing overdubs in my home studio. So it was kind of a fluid process between completing these tracks alongside my material that'll be out in the spring on my forthcoming album, Myopia. So, if I had wanted to turn this into a full album, I probably would have had to put my own, album that I'm working on hold, and I definitely didn't want to do that. I just wanted to, get these songs out, share these tracks as soon as I could in time for the holiday season.
I think you addressed this a little bit earlier when you were talking about your family taking you to Broadway shows and dance and so forth, but you seem to have a tremendous creative drive, especially to do all of these different things that you do. Do you think that came from your upbringing?
I always joke to my friends because they'll say funny things to me like, God, like you're so driven, or you're so disciplined, or whatever, about something from my past that seems like on paper and impressive to them in some way, like a camp or a school that I went to. And I really do believe this with all my heart. I always joke that like anyone who had grown up in my household would have been at least as quote unquote accomplished as me, because I happen to have had, a set of parents who were, borderline, encouraging / vicariously driven through us themselves. So, there was a lot of discipline, a lot of structure in my house growing up. My mom is a really, really just sophisticated, insightful very well read and savvy person who knows good art, good music, good dance. You know, she was a ballet dancer herself. And I think that was huge for us. I think that I was lucky that my own interests aligned with that level of encouragement. But, you know, I think it would have been impossible to kind of grow up in my household and not do at least like 6 extracurricular activities after school. So, that's just like how we were raised. It really was. It seems strange to me to describe it to you, but that's the reality.
It seems like you embraced so much of the arts.
It, absolutely. And I was really lucky that specifically music and dance, you know, took hold. I kind of hated ballet for a few years in there, you know, maybe around like 9, 10, when it just got to be really hard, and it suddenly wasn't just like jumping and spinning and improvising to, you know, to music. It was really like kind of painful to do 20, you know, dégagés in a row with the teacher, you know, kind of being strict if you didn't do it right. And that starts to feel like, oh, this sucks. Like, this is hard. So I come home and say I want to quit and like cry and be like, I don't want to go back. She's mean or it's too hard. And, you know, my mom basically had the attitude that, you know, okay, well, it's okay to quit one thing, but you can't quit everything. And I had already sort of wriggled out of piano lessons and managed to convince my family that in spite of my obvious, you know, sort of, natural ability, I hated piano lessons. I just wanted to teach myself and do it by myself. So they let me do that. They let me quit piano. But when it came time, you know, that me trying to quit ballet, they said, no, we let you quit one thing. You're going to stick with it and it'll get easier. And maybe in a year or two, we can have that conversation again. So that's kind of, you know, it was almost more about the lessons of committing to something that would keep us focused and that would give us back what we would put into it. That's really what, you know, what it was about.
You just mentioned that you did take piano lessons at least for some time.
Literally like 2 lessons in school. I went, like, they tried to get me to play in a recital because they could tell I could already play by ear. But it was so frustrating for me because they couldn't really wrap their heads around, like, the music department. I couldn't read a note of music, but I could play already quite proficiently. So they just were like, just read the sheet music, like play this song in the recital. And I'm like, I can't even read like a scale. I have no, you know, and I just gave up and cried and came home and said, no way.
And already being able to play, you probably had no interest at all in going back and starting with Mary Had a Little Lamb just to learn the notation.
You know, I look back and I just think like I probably had the wrong teacher. You know, there were a couple of others that tried through the years to sort of recruit me because they clearly would see me being expressive in that way. You know, if there was a piano in the room or like at camp, I would accompany, you know, campers singing all kinds of pop songs on the radio, and somebody would inevitably be like, you know, let me give you lessons or whatever. And any time that I tried to really embark on that process of learning how to read notation, read music, and, you know, every good boy deserves fudge, it just felt like every cell in my body would just rebel against processing music that way, and I could never really embrace it. And I wish that I could, and I wish that I had, because it would be wonderful to be able to transcribe and score, you know, for orchestra and for a whole string section instead of having them just like play individual parts on a keyboard for people. But, you know, I'm also grateful that I live in a city like New York where there are fantastic musicians who cross all different genres and play jazz and pop and folk and can pretty much learn anything by ear. So. You
seem to be, from the way I'm reading it at least, well on your way to a career in dance. I mean, you danced with the New York City Ballet, and I'm guessing that this was during like your early teens and mid-teens you were with them.
Yeah.
What was the point or the deciding factor that made you decide to branch off and kind of concentrate on music instead of dance?
That's a great question. And it's, it's no secret, like I'll talk about it on stage too. I danced pre-professionally and then professionally only in the sense that, I was cast in ballets with New York City Ballet while I was a student at the School of American Ballet, which is their conservatory. But I never actually got past that point of being in the school. So, I would go to School of American Ballet, or SAB as we called it, every day after school, come home very late. I'd rehearse for things like Nutcracker and Coppelia, and it was exciting. And it was amazing. So I got to quite a high level, technically. But then there's that crossroads where, as a pre-professional ballet student, you are required to actually begin going to class in the middle of the day or even in the morning during what are standard academic school hours. And at that point, when you're 15, 16, the majority of the kids at a place like School of American Ballet or Juilliard, if you're a violinist or whatnot, they start attending a school like Performing Arts High School, or they start doing school on correspondence courses or homeschooling. And my family just didn't really believe that was the right kind of education that, they should be giving us. They wanted us to be in like normal school. So it was just really that. It was that juncture where it started to interfere with regular academic education, at which point they, gently as they could, basically relayed that wasn't going to be my path, and they didn't say like, don't dance anymore, or you can't do it on the weekends, or find a place locally or whatever. But because of the type of person I was, because of the type of personality I had evolved, if I couldn't do it sort of at that highest level where I'd become so passionate about it and it was so intense for me, I pretty quickly lost interest in doing it like just as a hobby, and at that point, just probably within 2 years of that, I started auditioning for plays and going out for the lead in the school play and things like that. And my passion shifted more to acting as a secondary artistic, endeavor. But music had really been there the entire time through all of it. I was always doing music when I did dance. I was always doing music when I did acting. And that was really a constant. So that was never like a choice to refocus on it. It was more of a shift between dance to acting at that particular time in my life.
You, along with being all-encompassing as far as the arts go, you also, early in your life, had to kind of become a businesswoman and starting your own independent record company. And whether that was out of necessity or out of drive, I don't think makes a lot of difference. It's the fact that you started that and have kept it up your entire career. You have been with your own independent label.
That's true. It's one of those funny things where at the time it felt like such a sort of a default, like a natural extension of my sensibility. And, I had always been a little bit sort of DIY, I wanted to produce my own demos, I wanted to learn how to use a 4-track and produce myself. I was never someone who was as eager to let other people make creative decisions for me. I don't really know where I get that from, but it's something that I've had in me since I was a little kid. I had it also with things like I had like a little mini barrette business when I was in junior high school with my best friend, and we would, buy materials and make barrettes and sell them to little boutiques in our town, and we would learn the business part of it and how much to mark things up to make a profit, all that stuff. And it taught us a lot. And I do say that early experience of sort of making crafts and things that we were selling that were creative and fun, but also useful and something that could be worn, and needed to have sort of a quality, base level sort of, quality to it, taught me a lot about running a record label too. It's very similar. So by the time I'd seen a handful of other people do it in the 90s, I thought, why not just go this route and save myself the sort of angst of some of my peers who had been signed to major labels who didn't know if the record would ever come out, or, were switching from this producer to that producer and labels spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and then deciding to drop them. And it just seemed like such a risky, scary rabbit hole of letting other people make all your creative choices. And frankly, it's just everything about that option turned me off, and the other seemed exciting and challenging in a way that appealed to me. So.
It's been, I think, 21 years now since you released your first album, and the music business has gone through this tremendous upheaval and change of direction and so forth. Do you find it harder or easier now to get your music heard and to get your music out there than when you first started back in, I think it was 96?
Should I give you 30 seconds to guess? I think it's much harder. I think, it's one of those cruel ironies of the apparent level playing field also means that it's so oversaturated and everyone can do it. And when everyone can do something, it makes it more accessible and it makes it more equal, and that's wonderful and that's fantastic on so many levels culturally. When technology becomes accessible and people can make records in their living room or in their kitchen or their bathroom, that's great. But on the flip side of it, it does make it much, much more challenging, I think, to find that space where your work is offset in the right context, where you can be discovered, where you can be seen and heard in a way that actually, lands and isn't just one of a zillion things whizzing by. And it's also a parallel to just the culture that we're in now. The channel surfing, 30 seconds of this, 30 seconds of that, or even less on Instagram and everywhere else. So there are pros to it and there are cons, but if I had to just quickly answer, I would certainly say that on a substantive level, for me personally, it is more challenging to get gigs and to, have press highlight your work and to, keep building an audience to attract a new audience. But that's, I've never shied away from a challenge, and I love what I do and I love making music. So these are just uphill climbs that I embrace and try to do with as positive an attitude as I can. And it makes me grateful for people like yourself who are taking the time to highlight something that resonates. So thank you.
The whole idea of our site and the podcast and so forth is to concentrate on the artists who have been recording for 20 years or more. And the fact is that however hard it is for young artists, I think it's getting even harder for artists in that particular area who have this tremendous history, who have had weathered all of the storms and so forth, and yet it's so hard for them to get their new music out there. And that's what we have tried to do, is to try and help get the word out on such things.
Oh, well, bless you, for sure. I mean, it's fantastic that you're doing that. And, it's also something that encourages me to stay in touch with the larger independent music community, to constantly be learning from younger people coming up too. I do a lot of, connecting and listening and observing with people who are half, a third my age, and asking how they're discovering music, asking them about, what they love about YouTube and things like that, because I do run a label, and it's important for me to, be in touch with how people discover music now. But there is definitely that generation gap, I think, between, the YouTube star and The Voice and America's Got Talent and all of that, and the idea of the bard who kind of comes up, paying their dues in small clubs or whatever. And, it's an interesting landscape for sure.
I know that you have said in the past that the music and the writing of Carole King was a huge influence on you when you were starting and now. Who else and what other genres were big in developing what you have become?
I'm glad you brought up Carole King, because honestly, one of the reasons I wanted to put out an EP of holiday music was because she had done the same. And I'm also a fan, of the Broadway show, Beautiful. I'm going to go see it again for the second time this weekend. So, she's huge for me. But yeah, I had a really eclectic array of influences growing up. I knew of and embraced the Beatles very early because my dad was really a huge fan. He actually sold Beatle wigs as a college job. He introduced me to the music of Buddy Holly and the Drifters and all kinds of acts from the 50s, primarily the 50s. That was his genre. And then my mother was into folk music, and we had Judy Collins and Joni Mitchell records in the house, but also a lot of Broadway and some jazz. And then I was just kind of a normal kid in the sense that I really did enjoy and embrace what was on the radio in any given time in my life. So it was everything from artists like Howard Jones and, George Michael, when that was on the radio, to more alternative acts like, U2 coming up before they were really famous, I was really into, and things like New Order, and then I went through my folky phase by the time I got to college with artists like Suzanne Vega and Sean Colvin and Ani DiFranco. So I guess the through line was always melody and lyrics, something that could really kind of hook into my developing sense of what constituted a good song, what was a song that I wish I had written, and the more that I learned about the craft and the history of songwriting, the more exciting it was for me to listen to more different types of songs and composers, and I just have a huge respect for that aspect of the craft itself. Where does that inspiration come from, and what is it about this particular artist that informs, their repertoire? And I also happen to be really into solo singer-songwriters, probably even more than bands. So when certain acts like Elvis Costello became more of like solo artists versus like, him with his punky band, I started to like it more because it was more about very personalized lyrics and storytelling. And that's something that really, draws me in.
I think that's one of the things that radio today is doing a really poor job of, and that is exposing people to a variety of music. When I was in college, and that would be in the mid-'70s, it wasn't unusual to hear Led Zeppelin segue into Judy Collins, who I know you've toured with, Judy Collins singing Amazing Grace, to Al Green and Gladys Knight to Charlie Pride. Because they all had hits on the charts at the same time.
Well, I often joke about being in the wrong era, and you just nailed it, because that's what's exciting to me about music, is that eclecticism.
And today you get these very, very narrow bands of style of music, and people get set on one, and they don't get exposed to the other styles that really they need to be well-rounded as far as music goes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree with that. In a lot of respects in terms of radio, for sure, and how fragmented it's become. You have your AAA station or your country station or your Christian station, or your classic rock station. But that heyday of radio playing a real variety and it all sort of falling under the umbrella of pop or pop rock is definitely a thing of the past. And that's an era that I revere and from which I drew an enormous amount of inspiration, and especially the 60s and, you know, the Beatles and the Stones and all those bands that were kind of, you know, pushing each other to keep doing something more and more innovative and out there, and yet it still was catchy, you know, but it was adventurous and those are my eras, the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Those are my eras also, but for a different reason.
But then, you know, honestly, like when I was coming up with synth pop and all that kind of stuff that was on the radio, I still wanted to be part of that, you know, so like I have an old soul, but it was always just the songwriting and wanting to be part of that broader landscape of pop music affecting culture that really, you know, drew me in and excited me as a performer.
One last question.
Sure.
How do you think, what is it about your music that you think drew choreographers and people in the dance world to embrace it and to use it as much as they do for their pieces?
Well, I think it was two things. You know, I think musically, it's probably a lot more on the surface than I really realized how much that classical music I heard in ballet every day for, you know, 15 or however many odd years, how that sank into my lexicon as a pianist and just the types of melodies I write, the arrangements that I do with strings. They're a little on the orchestral side. You know, I think there's something naturally sort of flowing, fluid about it, because that's how I learned to create music, was actually through music I heard in the dance context. And then I think it's also the lyricism. Lyrical dance is something I did not grow up with at all. I mean, that whole idea is still like kind of strange to me, but you know, the fact that dancers are listening to the lyrics and trying to mirror and convey a story based upon the words is such a good fit for what I do, because it's, you know, it's like the best of all of the worlds that I love kind of combining. It's been really exciting and an amazing confluence. So I just am grateful for it. And, you know, I'm not really 100% sure, but that's what I've tried to sort of wrap my head around at this point.
Wait, I have to ask, when you were writing the music for your last album, Choreographic, were you visualizing how it might fit into a dance, even though it's a dance world that you may not have been trained in, but were you visualizing that as you wrote?
Oh, absolutely. That's like the entire premise of my last album of Choreographic. I literally holed myself up in a hotel room between a couple of festivals in England, in the town of Camden in London, and I would not let myself leave the hotel room every day until I'd written at least one song. And my overarching concept was that each song was a dance. It was composed for choreography, and I would envision that in my head, and that would absolutely, you know, impact what I would play on the piano or the guitar. And it also, you know, just gave me more colors to work with imaginatively, which is always a good thing when you're trying to write, especially when you're trying to write a little bit more quickly than you might otherwise. It always helps to have a theme or a, you know, just kind of a song cycle concept. So yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us a chance to talk with you.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm going to tell you, I'm actually going to see the ballet, The Red Shoes, tonight. So that's a good period on this interview.
Well, I wish you all the luck. Joy is out, I think, a week from Friday on the 10th of November.
That's
is that correct?
Right, yeah. Yep.
And I wish you much luck with it, and we will definitely get the word out for you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Joy, Rachael Sage's new holiday EP, is out on Friday, November 10th. The VVN Music Interviews can be heard via iHeartRadio, YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Libsyn, and the VVN Music website. For the latest news on the veteran artists of rock, pop, soul, country, folk, and blues, go to vvnmusic.com. If you have any comments or questions about the website or this podcast, please send them to vvnnetwork@gmail.com. The VVN Music Podcast is a production of the VVN Network, copyright 2017.